Excellent. So let's get into this. So this week, as part of this, I was introduced to a man called Marmaduke Lionel Sands. And you'd look at a name like that and go, this is the best person out to research. So I did what all good genealogists will do. You put his name into lots of search engines. And so I found his plaque in the cemetery up in Whangarei for M.L. Sands, showing that he had served in both the South African War and the First World War. So in the South African War, it looks like he's in the 17th Lancers, and the East Kent Yeomanry for the First World War as such. So it was off to do a little bit of information searching for him. Now, I always like to start with a timeline. Timelines are a great way to just get everything in order, find out what you know already, add more information into the research, etc. So we're going to research Marmaduke. We're going to be basing that on looking at his South African War Service and his War Service in World War I. We'll just briefly touch on as well. Now, I know that's going to answer some questions that were asked in the chat before. So the first thing you do is you go off and do some basic research. And so here I am looking in things like census records and death records and newspapers and building them up a little bit of a family tree. Now, his timeline then expands. And from that timeline, I suddenly found that my death in New Zealand starts from a birth in England. And Marmaduke is born in Reading in Berkshire. His parents are Marmaduke Sands and Kate Tucky Stevens. And from the information from things like the newspaper articles about their marriage, I know who their fathers are and things like that. And I can trace him through a census record where he's actually living with his grandmother, having found out that his mother had died when he was about 2. So he grew up with his grandmother and his father. So we're starting to build a bit of a story around Marmaduke and finding out what he was and who he was before he actually becomes part of the War Service. So let's talk about the 17th Lancers in the South African Service. Now, I would love to say that this was a photo of Marmaduke. That would be the perfect thing to find on the internet. However, this isn't. This is actually John William, or Jack Prince, who was also in the 17th Lancers. It's in Cork in Ireland, which is, we'll find out a little bit later. And so we can get an idea, however, of what Marmaduke would have looked like. So on to Ancestry, and I put his name in and didn't really come up with much in regard to War Service. However, there was a Lionel Sands who is born in Reading in Berkshire, so the right place. He's in the 17th Lancers and he's got the right regimental number. And this is showing in the Royal Hospital Chelsea pensioner records. Now, with all records that are on websites, it is really good to make sure you've read the whole page. And so you need to scroll down and get a really good description of what's in the records before you actually get into looking at the records. So scroll down, have a look and find out, why were these records created? What sort of information were they collecting? And what sort of information are you likely to find out about? It's also a good way of finding out if there are gaps in the information, because it's all very well that I want to go and look at Lionel. However, I may find out that the record itself doesn't cover the time period that he's involved, or that I'm looking from. So having a year range of 1760 to 1920 might mean that there are still gaps in that period of time, or there's very few records, etc. Now, at the very bottom, you find out that you actually need a subscription to a further website called Fold Free to gain this record set. But for those of us that have family searches, Find My Past as well, you can find the records on there. So this is the Chelsea pensioner record. This is the record that Lionel was standing there having filled out about him at that time. So we know that he's 18 years and 9 months old, and that he had resided outside of his father's house for over 3 years in Folkestone, but he didn't pay rates. So he didn't own the house, and at 18 I would have been surprised if he'd been owning the house and paying rates, etc. So he's obviously living with someone. He's signed up in Dover. So on the 29th of November 1900, he's gone down to Dover from Folkestone, he's signed up and said, yep, and I want to join the 17th Lancers. Now, this is a 4-page document. The second page is all about a description. So you're getting height and weight, you're getting his complexion, that his eyes are light brown and grey, that his hair is light brown, and that he's Church of England. You're also finding out about any scars on him. They're going to record this sort of information because if they need to identify a body later on, they need to know what that body might have looked like to start off with. Then we move into the statement of his services. So we know that he enlisted on the 29th of November, but he actually joined the regiment in Cork on the 4th of December. So that photo that we looked at right at the start about Jack Prince could well have been something similar that he might have had taken at the same time. He's posted as a private, but we also find out that in 1903, he's discharged at his own request, having served 2 years and 211 days with the 17th Lancers. Now, the really good news is that on the last page of this record, we actually find out that he lists his father's name as Marmaduke Sands. So that nicely confirms that our Lionel is Marmaduke Lionel Sands. Interestingly, he says his father's address is unknown. And it's some other research takes me to look at the 1901 census, which doesn't have any of the recruits in it for the South African War that are in the army and things like that. There is no census records for them. So if you're looking for someone in 1901 and they disappear, this may be a good reason why. And however, Marmaduke himself, he's living in Chelsea and London. But it's the top section of this page that I'm really interested in, because this is telling me where exactly Lionel is. And for nearly the first sort of 18 months of his service, he's actually stayed home in England or in the UK. He goes to South Africa on the 23rd of May, comes home on the 18th of October, and stays back in home as such right through till June 1903. Now, the really great thing about army records is they have given us some dates for these pension records. The unfortunate thing is because he's a private, he doesn't necessarily get mentioned in a lot of things. There are a lot of records that will only list officers, for example, or what the officers are doing and name the officers. So being a private, he's often not found in these records. However, there isn't anything to stop you then looking for the group as a whole. So by Googling the 17th Lancers, you can find information, and we can find information in the newspapers. In this case, we find out that one officer and 52 men were put on the Transport Victorian, and they left Queenstown in Ireland, heading off down to South Africa on the 22nd of May. Now, when you don't know a lot about a particular regiment or a particular battle or a particular war, it's a good thing to Google. And Wikipedia, I know it's not the best, and I know that it has problems as well as benefits. However, it's a good place to start. And it's able to give me a bit of an idea of what's happening with the 17th Lancers. And in this case, I found out, for example, that the 17th Lancers had actually gone to the Second World War, the South African War, in February 1900. So there's no reason really that would have stopped Lionel actually getting there earlier than when he did. However, it was really the date of June 1902 that made a little bit more curious about exactly what Lionel might have been involved in. Now again, as I said, roll down, find the sources, because that's going to lead you to books. It's going to lead you to further reading that you can have a look at that may give you more detail about what's happening. But those dates. So he departed England on the 23rd of May or thereabouts. There was meetings about peace on the 12th of April. The treaty, as we've heard, was signed on the 31st of May. I'm pretty sure that the trip from England or Ireland all the way down to South Africa probably took more than 8 days on the boat. So by the time Lionel actually arrived in South Africa, peace had been declared. So what exactly might he have been doing? Well, that's going to take more research. I haven't got access at the moment to a lot of the books and things that we'd want to use, so it's back to the newspapers to find out when they came back to the UK. In this case, they arrived back in England, in Southampton. There's several regiments on the same boat. The boat's called the German. And they also says down the bottom that the Lancers were entrained for Edinburgh and Glasgow. And so they were going off further afield. And that's where doing more research in these newspapers could be really useful. You're going to find out a lot more detail about what the 17th Lancers were doing. You're going to need to look at newspapers from more than one country, more than one city, and just trace that through. So his timeline's filling up. We now know a little bit more about what he was doing in that early 1900s period of time. And we can trace him through the 1911 census, where he's again living with his grandmother in Folkestone in Kent. And now he's a shipwright and a boat builder. So a little bit different to being in the army. We can find when he marries Ethel, and he marries Ethel Fuller in 1914. And then we head into his World War I service. And the photo here is from the beach at Gallipoli as a bit of a heads up of where he's going to end up. Now, this is where we get to the sad part of all of this. For many of you who may have ancestors that are from England or from Britain and enlisted in World War I, this is when you find out about the burnt documents, where 80% of the records were destroyed in September 1940 when the bomb hit the War Office repository in London at ARNSIDE Street. Of the records that survived, many are damaged, many are water damaged. I would love to say that I was really lucky and that Lionel appeared in the 20% that survived. However, he doesn't. The image that I've got on the screen at the moment is actually one of my own family that did actually manage to survive. However, if they did survive, they are digitised, which is great. So you can look them up on Ancestry. They're in two different collections. There's the service records and there's the pension records. So have a look in both, because some of the records were taken out of the service records collection and moved across when they were looking at pensions. But what does exist is medal cards. And Jason was talking about medal rolls and things this morning as well. And the medal cards give us a little bit of information about Lionel. They do tell us that he was a Lance Corporal. They also tell us he was a private. What order those two things occurred is up for debate at this point in time. They tell us that he was at the Theatre War was 2B, the Balkans, and he entered on the 8th of October 2015. We can roll and see other medal rolls as well. This is the awarding of the British War Medal and the Victory Medal. And this is the award of the 1915 Star for his service. So we know that he's a private at some stage. We know that he's a Lance Corporal at some stage. He serves in Gallipoli, and that he discharged himself based on time expired when he left the army in 1916. And again, we have to go off and look a little bit further to find out. Now, one thing that has been digitised for this period of time is the war diaries from the UK for Gallipoli and the Dardanelles, and they're available on Ancestry. And I thought, well, this is great. I know that he's in the East Kent Yeomanry. So I went and I had a look at the list of files that are there. These are browse only, so you've got to turn the pages and read them. And I went through and I thought, there is no East Kent in this. East Lancashire, East Yorkshire, no East Kent. This isn't good. So back to my friend Wikipedia just to see if I could find out anything else about where this regiment was serving. And it says that they landed in Gallipoli on the 8th of October. Well, that's consistent with what was on his medal card. But they were attached to the 42nd Division. So they didn't serve as themselves as such. And lo and behold, there is a war diary for the 42nd Division. Now, war diaries are a huge source of information about what is actually happening day by day for each of these regiments and things like that. So although you may not have anything that mentions your soldier and ancestor personally and by their name, you may be able to find out what was happening. And on the 8th of October, nothing of importance occurred during the night. Probably a really good, quiet arrival to an extent for Lionel arriving into Gallipoli. Occasionally you will get individual names. They're not indexed, so you will have to read through them. But obviously the amount of fatalities at these particular battles were large. They're not all going to be listed in the diary. So over time we're able to build up a little bit more information about Marmaduke, and we find out that he has 3 children, Lionel Yeoman Sands, Leonard Sands and Ethel Kate Sands. So where does this actually turn to become a New Zealand story? Well, the family immigrated to New Zealand in 1920 on board the Ionic. Lionel again listed as a shipwright with his 3 children and his wife coming out to New Zealand. And then we roll into the next generation, where Yeoman Lionel Sands is listed on the Northland Roll of Honour as being presumed killed in action in Crete. So this is Lionel's son. And it appears in the newspaper a couple of days later with the fact that his mother didn't believe that he was killed and felt that he was one of the British troops reported to have taken refuge in the hills. But it's a really good article in that it also talks about his father, and that his father had sailed for Gallipoli a month after his son had been born, and that his son had been christened yeoman because of the regiment that he served in. Now, as it turned out, Ethel was correct. Although he was presumed killed, he actually wrote to her from the prison camp. She'd actually been offered to get a copy of his death certificate and things like that, and at the same time was getting letters from him. So a story that ended up with a nice ending rather than something that wasn't so good. So we can build Lionel's timeline out. I can fill in the dates, I can fill in the places, I can fill in that background information. We can build that up and take that right through, and there's still gaps, lots of gaps to be filled in. And so we can go to libraries and we can read and we can research and we can find out as much information as possible about the time, about the person, about the places and things like that. But I have to say, one of the most important things is that we talk to people and that we listen and we record the stories, because if we're not out there doing that now, they're going to be lost. So you need to go and talk to the grandchildren of Lionel. You need to talk to the children of Lionel and find out what stories they remember about their grandparents, etc. And I encourage you to go and do the same.